Hello, teachers. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're seeing us from. Happy New Year. Happy to 2025. I hope that you all have a very prosperous, healthy, and happy New Year. Okay, so to start off the new year, we're going to talk about a topic that, as you can see on the screen, says cultivating communicative competence. Before we get started with that topic, please comment in the chat. Let us know where you're connecting from. Say hello to everybody. And let us know also what are your goals as English teachers in this new year, right? So we have some people connecting. Hello, Karima from Algeria. Hello, Elva from Peru. Hello, Janine, Santi. Hello from Peru as well. Hello from Bolivia. Hello to Yolanda in Bolivia. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited that you're here. So let us know in the chat, what are your goals as English teachers in this new year? Do you have specific goals for your students, for you as teachers? Share with us in the chat. Okay. So what are we going to look at today specifically? Well, in the topic of communicative competence, we're first going to take a look at a bit of SLA theory, which means second language acquisition theory, right? All of the recent webinars have been centered around second language acquisition theory, which is very important for us as English teachers to know. Then we're going to define communicative competence. And lastly, we're going to look at some activities, classroom activities and homework activities to develop communicative competence in our students. Okay. So first of all, we have to start with SLA theory. As I mentioned, SLA stands for second language acquisition. What does science tell us? Guess what? We have over 50 years now of scientific research that tells us about how humans acquire language. Yes, over 50 years. And now we need to take that science and we need to apply it to the things that we do in our classroom. So let's look at what the experts say. What do the experts say? These two names that you see on the screen right now are two names that you as English teachers should know very well. We have Noam Chomsky, who is a North American linguist. He's really a Renaissance man, we say. It's someone who knows a lot about a lot of things. He knows about politics, history, but he's primarily a linguist. And Stephen Krashen, who is also a North American linguist who has done a lot in the field of language acquisition. So Noam Chomsky says, language is an innate faculty. What does he mean by this? He means that all humans are born with the capacity to acquire and use language, right? Stephen Krashen adds to this and says language is best taught when it is being used to transmit messages, not when it is explicitly taught for conscious learning. What does he mean by this? He means that doing those drills and the memorization and the conjugation of verbs in charts and in paradigms and mechanical activities, that is not acquiring language. We do not acquire language that way. We only acquire language when we understand and transmit messages in the language, right? If we think about our first language, most of you in the audience today are Spanish speakers as your first language, but we have some other speakers of other languages from other countries. Think about your first language. Nobody sat down with you when you were a child and said to you in Spanish, vamos a conjugar el verbo hablar. No, right? They just spoke to you in your language and you naturally acquired it, right? So our brains are built to acquire language. They are already constructed this way. But we need to, as language teachers, be aware of the best ways to teach our students the language if our goal is for them to communicate in the language, right? Okay, speaking of communication, Communication can only be achieved by communicating. This seems very obvious, right? But how do we apply it to the language classroom? This means that drilling, repetition, and mechanical activities do not help us to communicate. They don't. We know this already, right? If I ask a question to a Spanish speaker and I ask them to randomly conjugate a verb in a random form in Spanish, for example, if I say estudiar en el pluscuamperfecto de modo subjuntivo, tercera persona singular. Normally, native Spanish speakers will say, what? And it's very difficult for them to conceive of their language that way, right? Because they haven't worked with their language that way. They've worked with their language communicating in the language, not conjugating verbs in different tenses and things like that explicitly, right? Okay, but wait. What is communication? We're using this term a lot. Communicative language teaching, communication, we must teach communicatively. But what does that mean? What is communication? Please share in the chat your definition of communication. Let's see if we can put together a definition of communication. Hello to all the people who are just joining us right now. Hello to Bolivia, to Peru, to different parts in the world. Thank you for joining us today. So what is communication? Share your definition of communication with us in the chat. Not ChatGPT's definition, not Google's definition, your definition of communication. Okay, so we have from Ameli, communication is sharing ideas. Good, that's definitely part of communication. What else is communication? Let's build that together. So we have from Jade, expressed your ideas. Absolutely, thank you. Yes. What else is communication? So we have this common concept of ideas. What else can we add to this definition? What is communication? It does have something to do with expression. Anyone else want to add to that? Feel free to share in the chat. What is communication? Okay. Santi, thank you for joining us. Santi, you're always with us. Thank you. Telling what you want to say, opinions, ideas, etc. That's definitely part of communication too. Thank you. Janet says communication is the skill sharing ideas. Yes. Okay, what else? Communication is exchanging information, ideas, or feelings between two or more people. Thank you. Arosamena, thank you. Sarai says to interact with another person is communication. You all have pieces of the definition of communication. Yes, discovering other cultures in our context can definitely be communication. Keeping in touch, to say to other people what you mean. Okay, all of this builds the definition of communication. So the definition of communication that we're going to use for our purposes is the following. The expression, interpretation, and negotiation of meaning in a given context. And I take this definition from another expert in the field of language teaching and language acquisition, whose name is Dr. Bill Van Patten. If you've never heard of him, he's a very, very good person to follow. He has a series of podcasts on language acquisition that are called Talking L2 with BVP, and he also has another series called Tea Time with BVP. These are very good podcasts about language acquisition if you are interested in learning more about this topic. We have to break down this definition, right? So we have the word expression. Here, when we talk about expression, we're referring to our students' production, right? So this is speaking, also writing, because that's also production, right? Interpretation in this definition means comprehension. That means comprehending spoken language and also written language. Negotiation. Negotiation is the clarification or confirmation of something. So if our students are not sure about what something means in English, they can say, what does this mean? Can you explain this, right? This is negotiation. Meaning is information, propositional content, things like this, right? And context in this definition refers to participants, setting, purpose. Yeah. What is our context? We don't use language outside of a context. We always must have a context for language, right? So this is the definition that we're going to use as our definition as language teachers of communication. And we have to take into account each one of these parts, right? Okay. That brings us to the part of defining communicative competence. Now that we've defined communication, we can define communicative competence. And this can be considered, again, a goal for our students to develop their communicative competence. Communicative competence is an essential language skill, the ability to adjust language use according to specific contexts, and to employ knowledge and strategies for successful communication. In other words, it's the ability to communicate in this case, English, right? Okay. Communicative competence consists of 5 parts. Some people say it's 4 parts, but more recent research says it's 5 parts, right? So we have linguistic competence, strategic competence, sociolinguistic competence, discourse competence, and pragmatic competence. So communicative competence is like the broad, right? It's the overarching term that we use. And within communicative competence, we have these 5 parts, and they're all competences also. We're going to look at what each one entails on these slides. So first, let's take linguistic competence. Yeah, linguistic competence consists of grammar, vocabulary, and phonetics. In other words, it's the ability to follow rules that govern the language. So this could be sentence structure in the case of morphosyntax, right? Vocabulary, pronunciation. These are the main things that we consider to be make up linguistic competence, right? But now I have a question for you. If we are teaching communicatively, like we should be, right? And if we are working on developing communicative competence, how important is accuracy in grammar? You see the question at the bottom of the screen? How important is accuracy in grammar? How important is this? Let's think about it, because if our focus is communication, how important is accuracy? And this is a difficult question for some teachers, because our instinct as teachers, our initial thought is, we have to make sure we correct everything, and their grammar must be perfect, and they must conjugate all verbs exactly right and everything. But again, if our focus is communication, isn't it possible to understand messages from someone without perfect grammar? I know this is rebellious sounding, right? Santi says, I think it's important for formal use of language, academic writing. Absolutely. Yes, we have to know how to write. We have to know how to use a formal register in the language, right? But in the initial stages of acquisition, is it that important? Let's think about it in little kids, in the case of little kids. When little children are acquiring a language, think of someone you know that's 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old. They are going to make errors in the language, in their native language, right? That happens. It's inevitable. Do we understand the children though? 90% of the time we do. They can conjugate verbs wrong in Spanish, for example, and we still understand them. The same in English. If I speak to a non-native speaker in English and that non-native speaker says to me, oh, yesterday I ate a delicious hamburger, I understand that message perfectly. Yes, the verb is ate in the past tense, right? But I understand the message. So like Sonia says here in the chat, she says, it's not very important, accuracy. In a communicative framework, accuracy is not the most important thing. Now, that doesn't mean we don't correct anything or we just let everything in complete anarchy, grammatical anarchy. No, that's not the case either, right? But we have to find A happy medium, like we say in English, some kind of balance between focusing on grammatical correctness and being able to understand messages, right? Yes, we should teach, the language in a according to prescriptive rules, according to grammar rules, but we can't always expect 100% accuracy. And if the students are able to communicate messages, this should be given a lot of importance, right? Okay. Thank you for your comments in the chat. Thank you, Viviana. For those of you who are commenting, thank you. Okay, moving on to strategic competence. As you can see in the word strategic, we're talking about strategy. So strategic competence is the ability to compensate for deficiencies in their linguistic competence. Yeah, so this includes things like paraphrasing, negotiation of meaning, gestures, creative language, etc. Okay, so let's imagine we have the case of a student who doesn't know the word wallet in English. They just don't have that word in their lexicon, okay? And they're talking to someone and they say, "Oh, yes, I remember last year I lost my what is that? It's the how can we describe a wallet? If we don't have the word for wallet in our vocabulary, we can say the thing where you put money, credit cards, a picture of your dog, etc., right? We can describe that thing. This is part of strategic competence. How are our students able to compensate for the lack of language that they have in their linguistic competence, right? They use gestures, they use creative language, like I just told you, describing something if I don't have the word for it in my lexicon. This is strategic competence, okay? Yes. Sociolinguistic competence. Socio meaning society, right? Dealing with society. So this refers to using language appropriately in different social contexts. This takes into account, for example, formal versus informal register, cultural norms, etc., things like that, right? So, for example, how is it appropriate to greet someone if you are in my city, for example, Chicago? If you are in Chicago, what is an appropriate greeting to someone you work with, to someone who is your neighbor, to your friend? What is an appropriate way to say hello? In my context, it's appropriate to say, "Hey." That's sufficient, right? But maybe that's not the case in different English-speaking parts of the world. Maybe the greetings are more appropriate to be more formal in other contexts, right? It depends. So this is what sociolinguistic competence is. We deal with register, formal and informal register. I remember, I can tell a quick personal anecdote. So I live in Quito, Ecuador, and I've lived here for 12 years. And I remember one of the first English classes that I taught, like the first semester, I was working on an oral exam with students at a university. I taught at a university. And I asked a student what their most embarrassing moment was of their life, right? And the student answered the question, and they proceeded to use a phrase that is very informal and that includes a bad word in English, right? And the student said the phrase to me during the exam, not to insult me, no, but as part of the story. And I remember thinking to myself, we need to work on sociolinguistic competence because this student doesn't recognize that the phrase that they used in the exam is appropriate when they're at a bar with their friends, but it's not appropriate to use in an oral exam with an English teacher, you see? So these appropriateness is a big component of sociolinguistic competence, right? Here's a question for you. When should we work on this with our students, sociolinguistic competence specifically? Do you think that this is something we need to discuss from the beginning, from the lower levels of classes? starting at A1 level? Do you think this is something that we can discuss later? Do you think this is something that we should teach every semester, every year? What do you think about sociolinguistic competence? How important is it, and at what level should it be worked with? Yeah. In the meantime, I will take a look at a comment from Maru here. It says, I think that linguistics is an important competence because we learn the pronunciation that is important to communicate with people of different countries. It's wonderful because English is a language that is spoken in all of the world. Yes, English is what we might refer to as the lingua franca, right? So it's a language that unites people around the world. I've seen it here in Ecuador. When there are tourists here in Ecuador, I see, for example, Japanese tourists, German tourists, and they're speaking English to each other. We are in Ecuador where we speak Spanish, but they speak English to each other. It's the lingua franca, so absolutely, Okay. So Lourdes says that we should work with sociolinguistic competence definitely from the beginning. And I can understand that, Lourdes, because especially with the example that we just saw with greetings, right? We teach greetings at the beginning of the students' English language learning, right? So we teach that at the beginning, so it makes sense to also look at that from the beginning. Okay. Discourse competence is another one of the components that make up communicative competence. And discourse competence is the ability to produce and interpret language in connected discourse, spoken or written. Yeah. Coherence, cohesion, transitions, flow, right? We remember what coherence and cohesion is. If we use, for example, certain antecedents with their anaphors, cohesion, that things go together, if a text is coherent. Like, for example, if I look outside and I say, today is a beautiful day, I love hamburgers. That doesn't make sense. Those sentences don't go together, right? So discourse competence is being able to produce discourse that goes together, that flows, right? Okay. And the last component is pragmatic competence. Maybe some of you have studied pragmatics before in your studies at university. So pragmatics is language in context, right? So pragmatic competence is understanding how context influences meaning in communication. This means recognizing implied meanings, making inferences, idiomatic expressions, and the nuances of humor or politeness, right? Things like that are different according to different languages, different cultures, etc. For example, where I'm from in Chicago, our sense of humor is very sarcastic, very ironic. And sometimes my sense of humor does not go very well in Quito because the sense of humor is different, right? So this has something to do with pragmatic competence, right? So we can develop students' pragmatic competence as well. And this is another sub-competence that should we develop it at the end, at the beginning, throughout their language learning process? That's something to think about. Okay. Question before we proceed to how we develop these competences. Do you believe that any of these competences are more important than others? Which ones and why? So remember, we had linguistic competence, which was the structure of the language, right? We had a strategic competence, the ability to deal with deficiencies in the language, sociolinguistic competence, discourse competence, and pragmatic competence. Do you believe that in order to communicate, that any of these 5 competences are more important than others? Which one or which ones and why? Is linguistic competence the most important? Do we need grammar to be able to communicate? Yeah, okay. Eliberto says all of them are important. Matilde also agrees all of them work together. Yes, Sonia also says they're equally important depending on the context. Okay, it seems all of you agree that each one is important, that they're all very important. Thank you, Semena, and thank you, Marlena, for your comments as well. You each say that they are all important. They are all important because it really depends. If I don't have a lot of vocabulary, I really need to rely on my strategic competence to be able to express something, right? If I'm in a situation where politeness matters a lot, I need to have good pragmatic competence to be able to be polite in that situation, right? So it really does depend on the scenario. Okay, thank you, all of you, for your comments. Yes. So the last section is developing communicative competence. Now that we know what communicative competence is and we know about the 5 parts, how can we work with this with our students? So what I did here was take each sub-competence and give you suggestions for classroom activities as well as homework. This is very important. Classroom activities, yes, so we can do communicative things in the classroom, right? Because we're teaching communicatively, because we know that's what's effective for language acquisition. But homework too. And I want to emphasize here that homework should not be divorced from what we do in class. Homework should be a mirror of what we do in class. If in our classrooms we are teaching communicatively, our homework should also be communicative. And what often happens is that we teach communicatively in the classroom, or we try to, right? We do our best. And then the homework is what? Worksheets. Those black and white worksheets where students fill in spaces and conjugate verbs and stuff. We can't give homework that's completely different from what we do in the classroom. Okay, this is a fundamental principle. So these classroom activities and the homework go together, because they're the same type of approach to language teaching, okay? So in linguistic competence, for example, we can do Jeopardy-style game with grammar questions, but we have to be sure that if we're going to work with grammar questions, the students are processing meaning. And this is something that is fundamental if we want to develop communicative competence. Teachers, for every activity that we do in the classroom, we must ask ourselves, is it necessary for my students to process meaning to do this activity? In other words, is it necessary that my students understand the English that is in this activity? If the answer to that question is no, don't do the activity. Why? Because you are not helping them to acquire the language. I know it seems like it. It seems like it for sure, but it's not happening, right? Language acquisition is very different from mechanical drills. Yeah, so it's really important that we always ask ourselves that question. In mechanical drills, where they need to fill in blanks with verbs that are already in parentheses, they don't need to understand anything of the sentence. Right? So we don't want to do those types of activities because they do not lead to language acquisition. We have the science that tells us this, right? So we want to replace those with activities that we can actually have students processing meaning, understanding messages in the language. Yep. Okay. Yes, we have a comment. Homework should be an opportunity to instill what you've learned in your long-term memory. Right. They should be a continuation of the class. Exactly. So we can do a Jeopardy game. If you don't know Jeopardy, there are templates on the internet. All you have to do is search Jeopardy template, and it's columns of questions that you form with point values. Yeah, and it's quite simple, and you can play it as a class, and it works well. We can also do peer teaching to review grammar structures. We can have peers explain to peers different things with different examples and stuff like that, peer teaching. Obviously, if your students are 7 years old, this is difficult, but once they're a little bit older, you can involve peer teaching. Homework, we can do vocabulary journals. They can do this on a phone. They can do this in a little tiny notebook. I know here in Quito, at the bookstores or the paper stores, they sell little tiny notebooks that you can put in your pocket. So students can carry these and have a little pencil and write new words as they come across them in different situations. And they can start a vocabulary journal where they have their own personal dictionary, right? We can also do task-based output activities focusing on target grammar or vocabulary. By task-based, we mean completing a task as the goal, right? And this is an activity that has steps. So we develop it in our instructions, step 1, step 2, step 3, and we have them incorporate target grammar and vocabulary in that activity. But they're doing something in a real life context. Yeah. Okay. Strategic competence. For our classroom activities, we can do games like 20 questions to guess a mystery object or person. If you haven't played 20 questions before, 20 questions is a simple game. You don't need technology. All you do is you, as a class, you have someone think of a place, a thing, a person, whatever. And then the rest of the class asks, they have a maximum of 20 questions. And these are yes, no questions, right? So if I tell a student to think of, I don't know, a food, I can ask the question, is it salty? And they say no. Another student could say, is it sweet? Yes. Okay. Is it cold? Et cetera, until they finally guess the mystery item. Yeah. We can also have students do 1-minute impromptu speeches based on quotes or opinion questions. What do we mean by impromptu? I can write on a piece of paper a question, for example, an opinion question about, I don't know, global warming or something that's relevant for students, right? Or I can write a topic, like talk for 1 minute about social media, for example. And the student has a minute to prepare, and then they just talk for a minute about the topic, yeah? With different opinions and things like that. Okay, we can all, right, guess who game is similar, thank you, Amelie, to 20 questions, that's right. Okay, and for homework, we can send an activity like a scenario problem solving activity, which is where we can give examples where communication breaks down. I can give them an example. Okay, this was the situation and here this happened. So we can say, ask the students, how could we resolve this, right? If this person wasn't able to understand this word or this phrase, how could we resolve that? How can we fix the problem? Yeah, we can send this as homework and then we could discuss it the next day in class. Okay, sociolinguistic competence. So as classroom activities, we can do role-playing scenarios in different social contexts. So we can have formal context, we can have informal context, the participants can change, etc. But just a slight word about role plays. Role plays oftentimes are not as communicative as we think because they end up being very scripted. In other words, oftentimes students write a script, they memorize the script, and then they regurgitate, recite the script. That's not so communicative. It's important to make these spontaneous. So to tell students, for example, okay, I'm going to give a scenario to each one of you, the pairs, for example, and you have 5 minutes just to generate ideas. What direction are you going to take your conversation? Do we need to make it formal, informal? What things are you going to talk about? And then have them have the conversation. So it's a thing where it's more spontaneous so that it's not scripted and written and memorized, right? We can also do an advice column as a class. We can develop it or have different students work in groups to develop an advice column for people traveling to English-speaking country on how to communicate. What are some tips? What should they think about? What should they do? What's different from communicating in their hometown, for example? If they travel to London, how obviously they use English, but what do they need to keep in mind about greetings, about asking for something, etc., right? And then as homework, we can do a type of cultural research project where students would research cultural norms. We could do this in groups because it's a little bit easier to do this in groups. They research cultural norms as far as how do people usually behave in specific situations. In this, depending on the student's level of English, I suggest perhaps considering allowing students to use their L1, which means their first language. And I know some of you are probably like, no, it all has to be in English. And yes, if they have the competence to do it in English, great. But if they're still developing that, it's okay sometimes to use what we call translanguaging. where we use the first language just for strategic things, right? Before we thought only English, only the second language, no first language, period. But now we're reconsidering that notion and we say it's okay to use the first language for specific things. So maybe they find a text about a cultural norms in, I don't know, South Africa, and it's in Spanish. And they read the text in Spanish, but then they present it in English. Or they read the text in English and they might discuss it in Spanish or in their first language. Depends, right? If that's a reality for you, and if you think this would help for your students to comprehend the cultural norms, you might want to consider using a little bit of the first language if it's necessary, right? Okay, discourse competence. In classroom activities, we can do a text analysis. So we choose different genres of texts and ask students to analyze the structure, the main ideas. How is this text written? What is the style that they reflect on it, right? We can also do something like a storytelling chain, which is where we have students build a story, either written, one sentence per student on a piece of paper, or orally, where each student adds a sentence. How are we developing discourse competence in this way? Because we're looking at coherence, right? We're making sure that the story stays in the same line. It goes together, it flows, yeah? For our homework for discourse competence, we can do paragraph writing with prompts being topics, right? Do a descriptive paragraph about your house, or do, I don't know, talk about your last year in school, or whatever the case is, right? We can do creative writing, which is something that I think in academia, at least, is often forgotten. Creative writing is a great opportunity for students to be creative, for them to come up with their own ideas, their own stories, use their imagination. So we can use creative writing because we need to make sure that we have cohesion and coherence in creative writing also, right? We can do, if we don't want to work with writing, we can do an autobiography video, for example, have students record themselves telling their autobiography. This has to go in chronological order, right? So this is also working on coherence, things like that. The development of a story, discourse going together. Yeah. Great, Matilde, you use the storytelling chain. That's great. Okay. And lastly, we have pragmatic competence, in which we can work with politeness strategies in a workshop in the classroom. So we can do things like requesting, giving advice, expressing disagreement, etc. How do we do these things depending on the context? Obviously, to ask your friend to lend you his pen is very different than asking your teacher if you can leave class early. So we can work on these types of things using scenarios as a workshop in the class. We can also, with students, observe interactions, like videos, social media, etc., and comment on politeness, appropriateness, etc. Yes, Yolanda says we can use online corpora for teaching pragmatics. The corpus can assist the identification of frequent real-life expressions and provide context. That's okay. That's interesting. That's even from a research perspective, we could use that. Okay. And then for homework, for pragmatic competence, we can, again, have students analyze videos and or social media interactions, look at things like politeness, appropriateness, how are they interacting, what phrases do they use, turn taking. In some cultures, it's very important to allow the other person to have their turn, they finish, and then it's your turn. In other cultures, it's very common to interrupt each other, and that's accepted, right? So this is also something we can look at. We can do WhatsApp audio exchanges, focusing on politeness with other students. Imagine you want to ask a student to, I don't know, tell you what you missed in class yesterday. How can you ask them? How does the student answer? Things like that. We can use WhatsApp as a resource because most of our students do have WhatsApp and can work with WhatsApp, those who have phones, of course. Okay, a final thought. In working with teachers a lot recently, I've heard comments from a lot of teachers saying, for example, this doesn't apply in my reality. This doesn't apply in my reality. I teach in a rural area of Ecuador, of Peru, of Bolivia, where Yes, okay, we do have different contexts where we teach, but it's very important to remember that language acquisition itself is universal. It does not differ between social classes, race, gender, etc. Urban, rural, no. We humans all acquire language in similar ways and therefore need the same things to be able to do it. So a student who is living in the middle of the Andes, somewhere in Ecuador, let's say, still needs the same things to acquire a language as a student who is living in Santiago de Chile, for example. We all need the same things to acquire language. We all need input in the language. We all need messages to interpret in the language, right? Unfortunately, it is the case in our reality in South America that there's a big difference between the public and private sectors. Some students have a lot of exposure to English, other students don't. But if our students don't, our responsibility is to provide them with more input and more real English so that they have a chance to be able to also acquire the language, right? Teaching them mechanically is not going to give them a better chance to acquire the language. So it's very important to remember that language acquisition is something universal among all of us all around the world. And we do it in the same way. Yeah? Okay, that brings us to the end of this webinar for this month. Thank you very much for your attention. Also, I would like to remind you to join us on the Zoom session. The Zoom link is now on the Facebook page, so you can take a look at that. In about 15 minutes, we'll connect on Zoom so that we can keep chatting about this topic. I'd love to hear your ideas, your experiences, talking more about communicative competence. Please, in the coming weeks, take a look at the RELO Andes Facebook page because we will be posting there a survey for you guys, because next month's webinar will be all questions from you. So I would like to hear your questions, hear what thoughts you guys have so that we can design next month's webinar specifically around questions from English teachers in the region. Thank you so much, guys, for joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of your month, and I'll see you in February. Bye.